Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. While Roosevelt's New Deal definitely showed action towards rebuilding the economy ravaged in the Great Depression, the truth is that within a couple of years, it wasn't showing any real evidence at breaking the Great Depression or putting people back to work in significant measures. And so Roosevelt began to take a new tactic, that of the Second New Deal. So, dear students, incline your ears and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have 5 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to describe the purpose of the Second New Deal, be able to summarize the New Deal programs for farmers and labor reform. You should be able to identify the Second New Deal programs aimed at assisting young people and professionals. You should be able to describe the changes that the New Deal brought to minority groups and to identify the groups that formed the New Deal coalition. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 12. By 1935, the Roosevelt administration was seeking ways to build on the programs that were established during his 100 days. The economy had improved during Roosevelt's first 2 years, but the gains weren't as great as he expected. Unemployment stayed high and production was lagging behind 1920s levels. Nevertheless, the New Deal was popular, and Roosevelt launched a second burst of activity called the Second New Deal. During this phase, the president called on Congress to provide more extensive relief for both farmers and for workers. The president was prodded in this direction by his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was a social reformer with deep humanitarian impulses and great political skills. Eleanor Roosevelt traveled the country observing social conditions and reminding him, the president, about the suffering of the nation's people. She also urged him to appoint women to positions. Subpoint B. The Second New Deal was underway by the time of the 1936 presidential election. Republicans nominated Alf Landon, the governor of my favorite state of Kansas, while Democrats nominated President Roosevelt for a second term. The election resulted in an overwhelming victory for Democrats, who won the presidency and large majorities in both houses of Congress. The election marked the first time that most African Americans voted Democrat instead of Republican. The first time that labor unions gave united support to a single presidential candidate. Roman numeral number 13. By the mid-1930s, 2 out of every 5 farms in the United States were mortgaged, which means that they were in debt. And thousands of small farmers lost their farms. Now, when I say small farmers, I want to make sure we're on the same page here. We're talking about farmers on small-time farms, not like short farmers, but small farmers losing their farms. Well, the Supreme Court struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, that we learned about in the last class. The AAA was struck down in 1936 by the Supreme Court. Congress passed a new law to go replace it. It was known as the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act, and it paid for farmers to cut production of certain soil-depleting crops that were just particularly hard on the ecosystem, but also rewarding farmers for practicing soil conservation to make sure things like the Dust Bowl wouldn't happen again, or at least could be avoided. In 1938, Congress approved a second Agricultural Adjustment Act that used a lot of the features of the first AAA, but were tried to arrange so the Supreme Court would find it constitutional. The second AAA did not include a processing tax, for instance, for farm subsidies. That was the provision that the Supreme Court struck down from the first measure, and that one was tried to... This is not unusual in laws, by the way. The Supreme Court will strike down a law, and then lawmakers say, but we still want that law, so they go to try to make it constitutionally compliant. Subpoint B. The Second New Deal also attempted to help sharecroppers and migrant workers and many other poor farmers in a rough position in the agricultural economy. The Resettlement Administration had been created by an executive order in 1935, and it provided for monetary loans to small-time farmers to go buy land. In 1937, the agency was replaced with the Farm Security Administration, the FSA, which loaned more than $1 billion to go help tenant farmers become landholders in their own right, and establishing camps for migrant farm workers who were traditionally living in bad housing. The FSA hired photographers such as Dorothea Lange and Ben Shahn and Walker Evans and others to go take pictures of rural towns and farms and their inhabitants. The agency used their photographs to create a pictorial record of the difficult situation in rural America. You're also getting a little glimpse into what historians sometimes call the alphabet soup of the New Deal and the Second New Deal. There's just so many acronyms. Subpoint C. One of the first reforms of the Second New Deal was the passage of the National Labor Relations Act. More commonly called the Wagner Act, after its sponsor, Senator Robert Wagner of New York, the act reestablished NARA provisions of collective bargaining. The federal government again protected the rights of workers to join unions and to engage in collective bargaining with their employers. The Wagner Act also prohibited unfair practices like threatening workers and firing union members and interfering with union organization. The act also set up the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, to go hear testimony about unfair practices and holding elections to find out if workers actually wanted union representation at all. In 1938, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set a maximum hours of 44 hours per week that a person could work, decreasing it later to 40 hours just a couple of years later. It also set the minimum wage at 25 cents an hour, increasing to 40 cents an hour by 1945. It's the first time that a national minimum wage comes into effect. In addition, the act set rules for employment under workers under 16 and banned hazardous work for those under 18. Although the Social Security Act wasn't a total pension system or a complete welfare system, it did provide some substantial benefits to millions of Americans. Roman numeral number 14. As part of the Second New Deal, Roosevelt administration set up a series of programs to help youths and professional and other workers that fell under the umbrella of the Works Progress Administration. One of the largest of these, the WPA, was headed by Harry Hopkins, the former chief of FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. The WPA set out to create as many jobs as possible, as quickly as possible. Between 1935 and 1943, it spent $11 billion to give jobs to, more than 8 million workers, and a lot of them were unskilled workers who were otherwise having a hard time finding employment. These workers would go on to build 850 airports throughout the country and constructed or repaired 651,000 miles of roads and streets and put up more than 125,000 public buildings. Women workers and sewing crews made 300 million garments for the needies. Although in a lot of ways, some of these jobs were criticized as make-work projects, as in they're not legitimate jobs, you're just inventing work for people. The WPA produced public works of lasting value to the nation and gave people a real sense of hope and purpose. In addition, the WPA employed a lot of professionals who wrote guides to cities and collected historic slave narratives and painted murals on the walls of school and other public buildings. They're performing in theater troupes around the country. At the urging of Eleanor Roosevelt, the WPA made special efforts to go help women and minorities and young people. Another program called the NYA, the National Youth Administration, was created specifically to provide education jobs and counseling and recreation for young people. The NYA provided student aid to school and college and graduate students. In exchange, students were working in part-time positions at their schools. For graduates that were unable to find jobs, or to youth who dropped out of school, the NYA provided public part-time jobs, such as working on highways or parks or on the grounds of public buildings. Set point C. One of the most important achievements of the New Deal was creating the Social Security system. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a committee chaired by Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins, our first the first female cabinet secretary. The act had three major parts: old age insurance for retirees of 65 years of age or older, and for their spouses. And the insurance was a supplemental retirement plan. Half of the funds came from the workers themselves who contributed to Social Security, and another half came from the employers. Although some groups were excluded from the system, it helped to make retirement more comfortable for millions of people. Also, an unemployment compensation system emerged. The unemployment system was funded by a federal tax on employers. It was administered at the state level. The initial payments ranged from $15 to $18 per week, but also aid to families with dependent children and aid for the disabled. The aid was paid for by federal funds made available to the states, and all of these things fell under the umbrella of the Social Security Act. Roman numeral number 15. Subpoint A. The 1930s witnessed the growth of activism by African Americans. One notable figure was A. Philip Randolph, who organized the country's first all-black trade union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. His work and that of others laid the groundwork for what would become later the Civil Rights Movement. During the New Deal, Roosevelt appointed more than 100 African Americans to key positions in the government. Take, for instance, Mary LaCoyd Bethune, an educator who dedicated herself to promoting opportunities for African Americans. was one such appointee of the Roosevelt administration. Hired by the president to head the Division of Negro Affairs in the National Youth Administration, Bethune worked to ensure that the NYA hired African-American administrators and provided job training and other benefits to minority students. Bethune also helped organize a black cabinet of influential African-Americans to go advise the Roosevelt administration on racial issues. Among these figures would include William H. Hastie and Robert C. Weaver, both appointees to Roosevelt's Department of Interior. Never before had so many African-Americans had a voice in the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt also played a key role in opening doors for African-Americans in the government. She was instrumental in bringing about one of the most dramatic cultural events of the period, a 1939 performance of the African-American singer Marian Anderson. When the Daughters of the American Revolution would not allow Anderson to perform in their concert hall in Washington, D.C., Eleanor Roosevelt resigned from the organization. Then she arranged for Anderson to perform at the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Sunday. Subpoint B. However, for as much as Roosevelt was advancing the cause of civil rights, he had a couple of important misses. Despite the efforts to promote racial equality, Roosevelt was never probably really committed to full civil rights for African Americans. He was afraid of upsetting the white Democratic voters in the South, which was an important group of his supporters. He refused to approve a federal anti-lynching law and also to end the poll tax, which were two real benchmark pieces of the civil rights movement. Furthermore, a number of New Deal agencies clearly discriminated against African Americans, including the National Recovery Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Tennessee Valley Authority. These programs gave lower wages to African Americans and clearly favored whites. In general, though, African Americans supported the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal, generally seeing him as their best hope for the future. Subpoint C. Mexican Americans also tended to support the New Deal, even though they received even fewer benefits than African Americans did. Large numbers of Mexican Americans had come to the United States during the 1920s, settling mainly in the American Southwest. Most of them found work laboring on farms, an occupation that was essentially unprotected by state and federal laws. During the Depression, farm wages fell to as little as 9 cents an hour. Farm workers tried to unionize, but they often met with violence from employers and from government authorities. Although the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration helped some Mexican Americans, these agencies also pretty clearly discriminated against them by disqualifying them from the programs for migrant workers with no permanent address, seeming to leave them out of some of the New Deal protections. Subpoint D. Let's kind of pick up the story on Native Americans as well. John Collier was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and he helped to create the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, an extreme change in government policy that moved away from the assimilation and towards Native American autonomy. It also helped restore some of the reservation lands to tribal ownership. The act mandated changes in 3 areas. First is economic, where Indian lands would now belong to an entire tribe. This provision strengthened Native American land claims by prohibiting the government from taking unclaimed reservation lands and selling them to people other than to Native Americans. There was also cultural protections, as the number of boarding schools for Native American children were reduced, and the children were encouraged and allowed to attend schools on the Native American reservations. But also political reforms, where tribes were given the permission to elect their own council and govern their own reservations. Some Native Americans who valued their tribal traditions hailed the act as an important step forward, but others had become more Americanized as individual landowners during the previous Dawes Act, and they objected to this action because they were tired of white people basically telling them what's good for them. Roman numeral number 16. In here, I want to talk about a political movement called the New Deal Coalition. Although the New Deal policies had mixed results for minorities, they generally helped back the president. In fact, one of probably Roosevelt's greatest achievements was to create what's called the New Deal Coalition, an alignment of diverse groups who were dedicated to supporting the Democratic Party. The coalition included white people in the South, but also African Americans and unionized industrial workers. And as a result, Democrats would dominate national politics throughout the 1930s and throughout the 1940s. The New Deal Coalition would stay active through the 1960s and pieces of it even including up until the 1980s, and that might be among Roosevelt's more enduring legacies. Subpoint B. As a result of the Wagner Act and other pro-labor legislation passed during the New Deal, union members also enjoyed better working conditions and increased bargaining power. In their eyes, President Roosevelt was a friend of labor. Labor unions donated their money to Roosevelt's re-election campaigns, and union workers pledged pledged their votes to support him. Between 1933 and 1941, union membership grew from less than 3 million to more than 10 million members. Unionization especially affected coal miners and workers in mass production industries like the automobile industry and rubber and electrical industries. It was in these industries, too, that a struggle for dominance within the labor union began to develop. Take, for instance, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. It had been traditionally restricted to craft unions like carpenters and electricians. Most of the AFL leaders opposed industry-wide unions that would represent all workers in a given industry, such as like car manufacturing. In the making of cars, you've got all kinds of different craft unions that would be involved. Welders and painters and people that would do electrical work. They would all have their own individual unions, and the AFL kind of liked having those separate unions rather than join together as making just car manufacturers. But frustrated by this position, several key labor leaders like John Lewis of the United Mine Workers of America and David Dubinsky of the International Ladies Garment Workers formed the Committee for Industrial Organizations to organize these industrial unions together. The committee rapidly signed up skilled and semi-skilled workers, and within 2 years it succeeded in gaining union recognition in the steel and automotive industries. In 1938, the Committee for Industrial Organization was expelled outright from the American Federation of Labor and changed its name to the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Subpoint C. One bargaining tactic of this changing labor movement was in the 1930s was the sit-down strike. Instead of walking off their jobs, which was a traditional strike tactic, workers remained inside the factories, inside the buildings, but they refused to work. They occupied the factories. It prevented the factory owners from carrying on production with scab strikebreakers who would cross picket lines. Some Americans disapproved of the idea of a sit-down strike, calling it a violation of private property. Nevertheless, it did prove to be an important bargaining tool, and a pretty effective one as well. Not all labor union disputes in the 1930s were successful. Perhaps the most dramatic incident was a clash at the Republic Steel plant in Chicago on Memorial Day in 1937. Police attacked striking steel workers outside the plant, and 10 were killed and 84 people were wounded in what's known as the Memorial Day Massacre, showing the real changing tensions between the labor unions and industrial production. Subpoint D. Roosevelt ran for re-election in 1936, and urban voters were an important part of the New Deal coalition. Supported by the Democratic Party, their support surged, especially in northern cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Chicago. These cities had powerful political organizations that provided services like jobs in exchange for votes. In the 1936 election, President Roosevelt carried the 12 largest cities in the country. And support for Roosevelt came from various religious and ethnic groups along the way. Roman Catholics and Jews and Italians and Irish and Polish people and Slavic peoples, as well as African Americans. His appeal to these groups were based on the New Deal labor laws and work relief programs, and all of it supported aid to the urban poor. The president also made direct and persuasive appeals to urban voters at election time. To reinforce his support, he appointed many officials of urban immigrant backgrounds, particularly Roman Catholics and Jews, to important positions. And Roosevelt won re-election in 1936 to his second term. The second New Deal didn't totally solve the problems of the Great Depression, but definitely showed forward movement and a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.